True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
On the day she died, Patricia Blakely Kimble was both in love with and afraid of her husband, Ted. After years of loving him and hoping for his love in return, the two were married in the spring of 1994. Ted's father, a Baptist pastor, officiated. It was the happiest day of Patricia's life, but for Ted the marriage was only a necessary step to further his career. His boss had told him that he could take over his business once he found a wife and settled down. Just over a year into the Kimble marriage, Ted had already checked out. He wasn't affectionate, and he began purchasing life insurance on Patricia without her consent. Deeply religious, Patricia was torn between her devotion to her wedding vows and the concerns she had for her safety. Join us at the quiet end for In the House of the Holy. 2 days after his wife perished in a house fire, Ted tried to collect on her insurance. When he was turned away because Patricia had never taken the required medical exam, he was enraged. The police took note of this as they were already looking at him as a suspect in his wife's death. But Ted had an ironclad alibi. So was he innocent? Or could Ted have had a co-conspirator? Investigators believed the latter, leading them to look more closely at Ted's relationship with his younger brother Ronnie Kimble. So lots to talk about here, and Christmas is coming up. We've got a beer that should suit that quite nicely.
Yeah, I guess you could call it a Christmas beer in the sense that it's kind of a gingerbread type thing.
Yeah.
Holiday.
Totally.
So the beer is called Ninja Bread Man, brewed by Asheville Pizza and Brewing Company, which is in Asheville of all places. It's an American porter, 5.6% alcohol by volume. Beer is a dark brown color with a medium-sized tan head. It's got a good aroma of roasted malt and spice. Tastes like chocolate, cinnamon, and nutmeg, gingerbread. So it's a pretty nice beer, and I'm happy because I think a lot of times brewers go overboard with the spice, the pumpkin pie spices and things like that. So, the nutmeg and cinnamon and clove and all that stuff. But this was nice. It wasn't too much of that.
Yeah. Well, full transparency, I've already had a couple of these, and I enjoyed them. They're really good with a Christmas cookie. And this year I was lazy. I didn't make my own Christmas cookies, but I ordered vegan Christmas cookies from Etsy, and they are yummy. And the beer goes magnificently with them.
I'll have to give it a try.
Absolutely. Well, let's open a couple up. So come on down to the quiet end. We see that there's finally a mall Santa here, but he is wearing a mask because of COVID, and that makes him look a little creepy because it's black. But I'm relieved when he sits down, takes that mask off to drink the ninja bread. It's a big relief because you don't want a scary Santa.
Yeah, like I just keep flashing back on Bad Santa, Billy Bob.
Yeah, I was thinking more like the serial killer movies about the bad Santas that come down the chimney and kill the families. And that's not something I want to even think about.
No.
No, of course not. All right, well, on the brighter side of things, he looks like he likes the beer. I know I like the beer.
Yeah, he seems to be enjoying it.
Yeah, I think I'll go sit on his lap while you start our story. How's that?
Yeah, that's just to tell him what you want for Christmas, though, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So let's start with Patricia. Patricia Blakely had a pretty happy childhood. Her dad worked as an electrician and a locksmith, and her mom worked in a factory. Now, between her mother and grandmother, there was always a family dinner on the table. Patricia had whatever she needed. They had a small house, which is nothing to brag about, but Patricia always felt fortunate. As children, she and her brother Reuben had friends, but they liked to spend most of their time playing with their cousins. They lived next door.
Yeah, I don't know if they liked to so much as it was more convenient, but it made for a close, extended family.
Sure did.
And Patricia was a really good student. She did have a gift for math. By the time she was 16, she was very self-sufficient and had saved enough money from her part-time job to buy her own car. Now at age 23, she'd saved enough for a down payment on her own house. So that's pretty impressive.
Good work ethic.
Yeah. So she was offered a bookkeeping job at a local grocery store, but she chose to work stocking the shelves because she just preferred to be physically active. She was always kind of a go-getter. Patricia often worked 2 jobs, and she spent her spare time seeking adventures. Like, one thing she really liked was roller coasters, and the more dangerous they were, the more she enjoyed them. But, deep down, she always wanted a husband and a family of her own. That was her ultimate goal in life.
Her future husband, Ted, was the eldest son of Ron Kimble and his wife, Edna. Ron and Edna Kimble had married young. Ron was only 17 and Edna 15 at the time they got married. Then a year later, they were parents. Took a year. I look at a 17 and 15-year-old figuring that someone's pregnant there.
Nope, they weren't pregnant. They were just very religious, and that's the way things were kind of done.
Oh, okay.
Maybe not that young for most people, but it wasn't super unusual where and when they grew up.
Yeah, okay. Then a year later, they were parents. That was Ted. 2 years after Ted was born, his younger brother, Ronnie Jr., came along. And for 8 years, the young couple worked in a mill about 20 miles northwest of Greensboro. And over time, Ron began to drink to excess, and he often would take off on benders, leaving Edna and the 2 boys alone. And during the time that Ron wasn't around, Ted and his mother became best buddies. Ronnie was often on his own. Then when Ron Sr. was 26, he quit drinking, and he gave his life to Jesus Christ. He was called into the ministry. So he and Edna left the mill behind and moved to Lynchburg, Virginia, where Ron enrolled at Liberty University's Bible School. And the boys, who were 8 and 6 at this time, were enrolled in a private Christian school. Now, Liberty that's a Jerry Falwell school, right? Isn't that
Yes. Actually, he's going to have a minor role in this story.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So when Ron started out as a young pastor at a small church, the family didn't have much money. It's not like it paid well. In fact, finances were always an issue for the Kimbles. For years, the family lived in a mobile home in a trailer park just outside of Pleasant Garden, North Carolina. That's about 20 miles south of Greensboro. He and his younger brother Ronnie learned a strong work ethic early on, and they knew the value of $1, and they really weren't afraid of a hard day's work. Ted had a very charming personality, which he put to use both personally and professionally. He was popular with the other kids in their neighborhood, especially the girls. So by the time he was a teenager, he was kind of known as a player, or an F-boy as they say nowadays. While Ted was confident, his brother Ronnie was very shy and awkward. Ted was calculating and manipulative, while Ronnie was more spontaneous. In high school, Ted had no interest in playing sports. His grades were just average to below average, and college wasn't in his plans. But this didn't bother him. He did have a plan. He wanted to become successful in business, and he wanted to get started right away. He didn't want to wait.
Let's go. So what Ted did was to take a part-time job at Lyle's Building Supplies. The owner, Gary Lyles, was a member of the church where Ted's father was the pastor. And Lyles liked Ted. He thought he was both determined and honest. Now, when he began looking forward to his retirement, Ted agreed to be groomed to take over the business. But Lyles wanted Ted to grow up and settle down before taking over. So Ted began looking for a wife. So this guy Lyles is saying, settle down, get married. That's a prerequisite for becoming the boss of the business.
Yes, because he didn't think Ted was responsible enough on his own, that he didn't save money, a bit of a player. So he wanted Ted to be settled down and married before he gave him that kind of power over the business.
Okay.
So Ted really did begin looking for a wife. In fact, he would propose to 2 or 3 women before settling on Patricia.
Yeah.
So it makes it kind of like, was he really in love with this girl? And we kind of think he wasn't, which is really sad for her.
Well, I would be looking at it exactly that way. I mean, if he gets told, I want you married before I'm going to turn this business over to you, and Ted goes running out and starts asking various women to marry him.
Well, I don't know if it was that blatant, but sure.
I tell you, his heart just ain't in it.
No, I don't think it was at all. But between working and attending church services, Ted did have a busy life. He began visiting a bigger church instead of his father's, hoping to meet just the right girl. So South Elm Street Baptist Church was frequented by some of his former high school classmates. And in 1992 and 1993, Ted dated Patricia's cousin, Janet Blakely. Ted had proposed to Janet, asking her to sneak off and marry secretly so her parents would continue to pay her college tuition. But she declined, and they broke up after that, when they were 18 or 19. But a few weeks later at church, the engagement of Patricia and Ted was announced. The ring Patricia wore was the same ring he had used to propose to Janet, and it's not like it was a family heirloom either. So Janet, who'd been dating him for a while and had turned down his proposal, was pretty shocked. She came home from college, and there's her cousin, engaged to her old boyfriend, with the same ring that was used to propose to her.
Imagine her surprise.
And it's not like she was heartbroken that Ted was going with another woman. She was more worried about Patricia. She thought Patricia was maybe being used, but she didn't want to tell her that. Now, Ted had met Patricia at the church, and Patricia told her friends that she had known from the first day that she would someday be Ted's wife. But at first, Ted and Patricia had just been friends, and then they were platonic roommates. Ted dated a lot of other girls, but Patricia was always just interested in Ted. She actually worked hard to get him romantically interested in her, taking a modeling class, doing aerobics, and buying some sexier clothing. So once Patricia and Ted started dating, his boss Gary Lyles really approved. He thought Patricia was great. She was kind and thoughtful and much more level-headed than the girls Ted had dated before. So he was totally on board with this, and there may have been a little pressure, unintended, for Ted to marry Patricia.
Yeah, and particularly if the boss is approving, he's going to let that be known to Ted, right?
Right.
So, yeah, keep this facade going.
Actually, Patricia used to come to the workplace quite often and bring Ted things she'd baked or things she would make him for lunch. And he wouldn't pay her that much attention, and she'd hang out sitting and talking with Gary Lyles, the boss, for a while. So they became good friends, and she was kind of worried about her looks not being good enough for Ted because she was chubby and just wasn't really put together so much. That wasn't her priority. So actually, Gary Lyles agreed to pay $500 for this modeling class she wanted to take. And she didn't want to be a model. She just wanted some tips to try to be more attractive for Ted. So it did work out. They did get engaged. And then May 7th, 1994 was Patricia's wedding day. She was only 26, but most of her friends were already married and some already had kids. She was glad, though, that she'd waited until she found someone like Ted, who she believed loved God as much as she did. She liked that Ted's father was a pastor because it meant that God would lead her marriage to Ted. And she felt like with God on their side, they would have a long and happy life together. So Patricia's coming from a whole other avenue than Ted is.
It sure seems that way.
So they don't really seem to have things lined up. But she's happy.
At this time.
Yes.
Now, Ted's brother Ronnie met his future wife in church also. Kimberly Stump and her parents, James and Judy, were members at Ron Sr.'s church. So Kimberly and Ronnie dated in high school, but their relationship was more of a friendship than a romance. After high school, Ronnie joined the Marines, and he was stationed at Camp Lejeune, where he would leave on weekends to go to church with his parents. While there, he and Kimberly rekindled their friendship, and it blossomed into love. So in September of 1994, Ronnie Jr., in September of 1994, Ronnie and Kimberly were married. Then Ronnie returned to Camp Lejeune, and Kimberly stayed behind.
So in February of 1995, Ted contacted Robbins and Wheel, Inc. to tell them about his intent to maintain the lease on the land Gary Lyles had, and he asked about buying the property. Days later, Ted met with Harvey Apple, an insurance agent for Mass Mutual, to discuss buying life insurance on his wife Patricia, and they discussed a $100,000 policy. At about that same time, Ted met with an insurance agent for State Farm as well, and they discussed buying $50,000 to $100,000 life insurance policies on each of them, Patricia and Ted. And just as something to think about, the property was going to be like $170,000, $180,000. And Ted had no money to buy that property. Now, in a follow-up meeting between Ted and the insurance agent from Mass Mutual, Ted decided on an additional $75,000 policy on Patricia, which would bring it up to a total of $100,000 payable to him from Mass Mutual upon her death. Patricia joined them, but then she refused to sign the paperwork. So there's a big red flag. Something was going on there.
I think so.
So in early October, an insurance agent scheduled a blood draw and a medical exam for Ted and Patricia Kimble. The appointment was set for October 5th, but it wasn't kept. Patricia didn't go. So this was clearly becoming an issue. Patricia didn't understand why he was wanting to get life insurance on her, and it frightened her.
Well, yeah. On October 9th, around 8:30 in the evening, Patricia's father, Richard, was alarmed to see his daughter-in-law, Patricia Blakely, burst through the back door of his home. "You gotta come now," she screamed. Her face was red and wet with tears. "Hurry! There's no time," she yelled. She pushed Richard out the door and to the truck parked outside. Now, this wasn't like Christy, who was normally calm and reserved. Richard got into the passenger side, and then he braced himself with his hand on the roof of the truck, because Christy was driving like a bat out of hell.
She certainly was, just taking off and staring at the road ahead. She was on a mission. Something was going on. It was dark outside, and Richard could see all the lights in the houses as they passed. And Christy finally told him, "It's Patricia, there's a fire." Patricia's house wasn't far from Richard's. Richard felt just ill, thinking that his daughter might be in danger. And as they approached Patricia's neighborhood, Richard could see the black smoke pouring from his daughter's one-story home. Out front, Richard's son and Patricia's brother, Reuben Blakely, ran to meet them. He was out of breath, and he told his father that he believed Patricia was inside the house. And this house was on fire. In his socks, Richard ran from window to window of the house, pounding on the hot glass and screaming out Patricia's name. It was looking very bad.
Yeah, I guess the house was really blazing.
Yes, black smoke coming out of all the vents and windows hot, just an inferno, basically.
24-year-old firefighter Alan Fields arrived on the scene in the Pleasant Garden fire engine. Dispatchers said someone might be trapped inside, and Alan knew that it was Ted and Patricia Kimble's house. It is the only house on Brandon Station Court. He saw Patricia's car in the driveway and started fearing the worst. Alan knew Ted and Patricia. He had gone to school with Ted, and he had dated Patricia's cousin.
Yeah, so this is definitely small town. Everybody knows everybody. As the firefighters made their way into the house, there was a large crowd beginning to aggregate on the front lawn. They stood together near the street, watching the house burn and just praying that no one was inside. Many of these people were members of Patricia's family. Some had gone to school with Ted or Patricia or knew them through church. Pleasant Garden was a very close-knit community, and if Patricia was inside, they knew there was no way she would still be alive. On the front side of the house, a firefighter smashed the window of the master bedroom with a metal bar and reached through the shattered glass. Then he reached inside with one hand, just hoping that maybe a body would be within reach and he could save someone. Then he knocked the remaining glass from the window and crawled through, carrying the fire hose. After 2 firefighters went through the window, Alan and his crew pushed their way through the smoke and into the kitchen. They had industrial fans placed to ventilate the area, trying to give themselves a path to enter. The flames seen earlier were extinguished, but the smoke was still so thick that they could only see inches ahead of them. A 4-foot-long hole had burned through the floor, leaving a big pile of debris in the crawl space beneath the house, and Alan fell into that hole and rolled off of the smoldering debris. But the pile beneath him could not be swept aside. It was too hard to be insulation, but it was too soft to be wood, and then he realized he'd fallen onto Patricia's body. It's a horror.
Seasoned detective Jim Church arrived at the scene after the smoke had cleared, but the interior of the house was very hot, and he could smell the unmistakable odor of burnt human flesh. So the burn pattern began in the kitchen, through the living room, and over the back of the sofa, continuing into the hallway. Church had seen enough fires to recognize an obvious pour pattern, and then a fireman had found a gas can in the kitchen also. So arson.
Oh, clearly, yes.
Then they heard some crying outside the living room window. A woman fell to the ground outside and was sobbing uncontrollably. A younger man bent over her and struggled to lift her up. This was Ted Kimble and his mother Edna. Church watched as Ted tried to lead his mother to a car, but she resisted, crying out and reaching out toward the house. She was hysterical. Ted appeared pretty calm.
He did, but maybe he was doing that for his mother's sake. A lot of men try and appear calm in times of distress. So he wasn't being judged right from there, I don't believe. But family and close friends met at the church after learning that Patricia had died in the fire. And this included Patricia's brother Reuben, who was the one who had called 911. The fire was so hot it burned a hole around Patricia's body, and that's how her body fell through into the crawl space. It was obvious arson, and whoever had set the fire had doused more accelerant in that area. So Patricia was face down and burned so badly that her left foot and her lower right leg had been burned off completely. Her arms were raised up above her head, and that's a clear sign that she was dead before the fire, because when trapped and dying from a fire, it's the human instinct to draw yourself into the fetal position. So they believed it wasn't the fire that had killed Patricia.
And the master bedroom was just a total mess. Dresser drawers had been pulled out and stacked on top of each other. There was a $20 bill sitting on top of a stack of other bills in the corner of the top drawer. There were pieces of jewelry, undisturbed. So unlike a previous burglary that had been reported and investigated at the Kimble house, this one was obviously staged. For one thing, burglars don't neatly stack dresser drawers, nor do they leave behind visible jewels and cash.
Well, that would just be stupid.
Yeah.
So Detective Church considered if it was possible that Patricia had walked in on a burglary, but he pretty much dismissed that idea. He had met Patricia, and he knew that she wouldn't have entered the house if she'd suspected a break-in. She'd been very frightened after the earlier break-ins. I think there were 2 of them at her house, and then she had vowed to be very cautious. He'd actually given her tips on how to be safe, and one of them was that if your house is disturbed, you don't go inside, if you think someone might be in there, or if there's been a robbery.
Right.
Now, down in the hole where her body had been found, 2 firemen lifted Patricia's body on a sheet. Detective Church leaned over that sheet and studied her charred remains. Then he saw the hole in the back of her skull. Other investigators had noticed it too. It was a gunshot wound.
Pleasant Garden Baptist was one of the larger churches in the community. The building was on a large plot of land with a full parking lot. Inside, there were many people, almost as many as there were on Sundays, for the services. Folding metal chairs were lined up and most were full. The faces were red as some cried, and others just stared off, looking shocked.
Yeah, she was very well loved in her community.
Yeah, she sounds like a sweet person.
Absolutely. Now, Ted's mom, Edna Kimble, the one who'd been crying and carrying on, was sitting alone at the church. And she looked out of place. She was wearing expensive jewelry and a dress, and she was kind of trendy, while the others there were in jeans and sweatshirts. But that's just how she was. A group of people were there with the Blakely family, that's Patricia's family, and some were embracing, holding hands, and moving their mouths in silent prayer. Patricia's dad, Richard, sat beside his mother in complete shock and misery. His mother, Bertha, held her pocketbook in one hand and Richard's hand in the other. Now, Ted's brother, Ronnie Kimble Jr., knelt beside her and was sobbing. He even rested his head in Bertha's lap. He was showing more emotion over the death of his sister-in-law than Ted was showing over the death of his own wife, and people noticed that.
Oh, sure.
Actually, Ted was waiting by himself in the pastor's study. So Detectives Church and DeBerry entered the study, and they saw Ted sitting there. He was young, muscular, like he worked out regularly, and he had a handsome face. He had dark brown curly hair that was cut very short. Now, after telling Ted that they wanted to ask him a few questions, Church explained that a body had been found in the house, but that his wife had not yet been positively identified. So Ted wasn't crying, but he was blinking and looking away.
Then they asked Ted if he had any guns in his house, and Ted said, "Yes, I do." And he actually had 3. He had a .45 caliber Glock. He had a Remington 1100 semi-automatic shotgun and a .300 Win Mag. Now, a .300 Win Mag was a bit surprising to the police. This is an expensive and high-powered rifle. It's the type of gun that's used mostly for big game hunting, and there's not much, if any, big game in North Carolina. Certainly not where you'd need a rifle like the Win Mag. And to top it all off, Ted wasn't a hunter.
No, he never hunted. Now, as they went into the pastor's office and sat beside Ted, they were going to start speaking to him about his wife and the fire and, all that stuff. But he complained of being cold. So they gave him a blanket, which he wrapped around his shoulders. According to Ted, he had last seen his wife around noon that day. He was speaking very clearly, kind of matter of fact. He said he had lunch with her that day. She got off work early at the Cinnamon Ridge Apartments where she worked as a manager, and her plan was to go home and mow her lawn. After that, she had prayer meeting there at the church. She never showed up for the prayer meeting. Ted had been at work, but he said he tried to call her at home. She didn't answer, so then he tried to reach her at the church. Then he found out she'd never gone to the church, so he got worried. So that's when he called Patricia's brother Reuben and asked him to go over to their house to see if everything was okay. Explaining that they had to ask this question, Church asked Ted if Patricia had any life insurance. And at first Ted answered that she had 2 policies, but then he corrected himself and he said that they had canceled one with Mass Mutual, so she only had 1. When asked the amount of that, he said $50,000, but then he changed it to $100,000, saying, "Well, I'm really not sure."
When the detectives returned to the Kimble house, a forensic technician was standing over Patricia's body, taking pictures. When he finished, they rolled her body over onto its back. So the right side of her chest was partially burned through, and this exposed her ribs and chest cavity. Her skin had split in several places, mostly around scalp, chest, and thighs. The Glock was found in the master bedroom. There was 1 round missing from the magazine. The gun was underneath a pile of rubble, where it had been stepped on and soaked with water, so it would be impossible to get any fingerprints off of it. The other 2 guns weren't found, and so someone could have taken them as part of the staged burglary. And looking at the stacked dresser drawers in the mattress, which appeared to have been pulled partially off the bed frame, Detective Church thought it looked like the worst staged burglary he'd ever seen. High praise indeed.
So Church walked into one of the other bedrooms where he saw a rolling Craftsman toolbox, and it was so new that the red paint was still shiny. It was slightly askew from the wall as if someone had tried to move it. Church opened the top drawer and he found that each tool was still neatly arranged in its place. So it looked like the owner or a burglar had never even touched those. Those can be pretty expensive, and I would think in a burglary, especially out in the country, someone would steal tools.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure you could sell them if you can't use them.
I mean, this is one of those toolbox models that had wheels. So
it's fancy-dancy. Big.
It's like a small desk or something.
It's for someone who's really using tools, right?
Right. Yeah, it's not like me with a hammer and a screwdriver and a pair of pliers.
Well, we have a plastic Craftsman box, which we throw things in. We have tape and screwdrivers, and not very official.
No.
No,
we wouldn't look very good next to the fancy red one.
No, we wouldn't know how to use the tools anyway. Now, there was a desk there too, and it was just as neatly arranged as the toolbox. Also, Church noticed an Olympus camera, 35mm camera, sitting near the corner of the desk, untouched. Money, jewelry, an expensive camera, and expensive tools, all untouched. And in the desk, the detective took some canceled checks with Patricia's writing on them. It was a flowing, neat signature, and he wanted to have those as samples of her writing. So he's right on top of things.
He is, and he was put in charge of the case, and which would be the first time that he would be the lead in a homicide. So Detective Church started out by interviewing Patricia's brother Reuben and his wife Christy. Reuben and Christy lived in Deerfield South, a newer subdivision with houses that were Cape Cod-style, ranch-style, or cottage bungalows, each of them on a 1-acre lot. So it was far enough away from the city, but still close enough to have access to the modern conveniences. So Christy Blakely met Church at the front door, looking very tired. Her reddish hair was cut short, and she had dressed for visitors. Christy led Church to the living room sofa. She told him that they had finally gotten Patricia's mother, Sheila, to go to bed around 6 a.m. She had stayed with her son and daughter-in-law. She and Richard had divorced a few years back, and they didn't want her to be alone. Reuben came into the living room, and he sat down beside Christy on the love seat. "When will we know for sure if it was Patricia?" he asked. Church told him that they would have the reports back later that day. Then Church told Reuben to start from the beginning, telling him what had happened. But Reuben had worked all day with his dad in Raleigh, he said. He got home around 8 o'clock. He jumped in the shower, and then Christy brought him the phone and said that it was Ted on the line. So he knew something serious must have been going on if Ted couldn't wait until he was out of the shower.
Well, Ted told Reuben that he'd been trying to reach Patricia and he couldn't get her to answer the phone. So he asked if he and Christy would ride over to their house and make sure everything was okay. Reuben asked him if he'd tried the church, and Ted said yeah, he couldn't find her there either.
Why was Ted asking Reuben to go check on his wife? Why wasn't he doing it?
He said he couldn't get away from work. But this is the first time he'd ever done anything like that. He wasn't buddies with Reuben. Or, if you're on the side that Ted was behind this whole thing, you could say he called Reuben because he didn't want to be the one to discover the body or the fire, right?
That's what I was thinking.
Well, sure. So Reuben said that Ted had told him he was at work and couldn't go home himself. He also couldn't keep using the phone at work, he said. Now, he'd been working at Precision Fabrics. This was his second job. He normally worked at Lyle's Building Supplies, Reuben said. In fact, Ted owned that business now. Church knew of the business, but he'd never shopped there. Ted had just started his second job, though, about a month earlier at Precision. Church asked if the building supply business was not doing well financially, but Christy and Reuben were unsure. They really didn't know why Ted had taken a second job. Getting back to the phone call from Ted, Reuben said that he was tired, but agreed to go over because Ted seemed to be close to panicking. Although you think if he was that upset, he'd leave work.
One would, yes.
But still, the panic in Ted's voice had caused Reuben to begin to worry. So it was around 8:30 p.m. when he and his wife Christy drove over to Patricia's house. When they got there, Patricia's car was in the driveway, and they could see the smoke coming out of the vents of the house. Reuben ran to the back door and put his hand against it, but it was very hot. He told Christy to check the front door. It was too hot also. Then Reuben ran to each of the windows to see if he could hear his sister or see anything, to know if she was in there. But there was just way too much smoke to see anything. So they tried to call 911 on a cell phone, but they couldn't get service. Then Reuben told Christy to go get Richard, that's his father and Patricia's father, while he continued to try and make the call to 911. Now remember, Richard lived close by. It was less than 2 miles away. And after Christy left for Richard's, Reuben ran up the road and was finally able to get a signal to get a call out to 911. The fire department got there right after Richard and Christy got back. And Christy asked Detective Church why the sheriff's department was involved in all of this. So he explained that anytime there was a body found in a fire, they had to look at everything and rule out all possibilities. He asked Reuben and Christy if they knew anyone who may have wanted to harm Patricia. And there was a pause as the couple looked at one another. And then Reuben finally said to the detective, "Well, maybe."
Okay.
Yeah.
So Church asked the Blakely and Kimble families to meet him and other law enforcement officers back at the scene at 4 o'clock that afternoon. The sheriff had scheduled a press conference for 5 o'clock. And at the conference he planned to announce the results from the autopsy and ask the public for their help. So news crews had already arrived in their vans and begun setting up their recording equipment. Investigators searched the front and backyards and the surrounding woods. Canines and their handlers walked the area while fire investigators continued to scour through the rubble of the home. Now, the Blakeleys and Kimbles showed up and they parked up at the curb. Church introduced the family members to the sheriff, then turned to Ted and asked to speak with him in private. So they went down to the gazebo, and Church spoke to him calmly and clearly. "Ted, the body we found in the house was your wife. It was Patricia."
And I'm sure that Church was just wanting to see his reaction to that.
Oh, yeah.
That's important. So Ted rested his hands on his hips and stared down at the ground. No tears. And he said, well, I already knew that. So it took Church a minute to collect himself, or at least a few seconds, because he was pretty shocked at Ted's cool, really kind of cold reaction. Then after that moment of collecting himself, he continued, Ted, the autopsy report showed something else. Your wife didn't die in the fire. Your wife died from a single gunshot wound to her head. And then Ted looked away, just watching the dogs walking on the property, because they'd brought in forensic dogs.
Yeah, now Patricia's mother, Sheila, was just a few feet away from them, and she overheard what Church told Ted.
Well, and Ted's reaction.
And his reaction. Sheila let out a howl and fell to the ground. Church looked at her, feeling sympathetic and distracted. And Ted said, well, she probably walked in on a burglary. We've been broken in a couple times.
Well, Detective Church just stared at Ted. He said to Ted, you told us you had 3 guns in the house, and we've only been able to find 1. So why don't you and I go into the house and you can show me where you kept the other ones? So he touched Ted's arm lightly and walked towards the house, but Ted jerked his arm away, kind of like he was annoyed by the whole thing. He told Church that he only had 1 gun in the house. He said he kept his 2nd gun at his office, and he denied ever saying that he'd owned 3 guns. This was another thing that Church was just taken aback by. He said, Ted, you told me and Sergeant DeBerry last night at the church that you had 3 guns in your house. If the Remington's at the office, what about the Win Mag? Where is that? But Ted said he never said that he owned a Win Mag. He claimed to have said that he was thinking of buying one. Now, why you would bring up what you're thinking of buying when your wife might be dead, I don't know. So Church was kind of confused, but he thought, well, maybe I'd misunderstood. Okay, then, he said, what about the Glock? Was it loaded? And Ted said, yes, it was. He always kept it loaded and ready. So a lot of things are really red flags here, hitting Detective Church right in the face. And you don't want to judge the husband by his reaction, but his is just way out of bounds.
Yeah, even for people that are on the low-key side.
Yeah.
That was really low-key.
Yeah, it's enough to at least make you think twice.
For sure. Now that night, a woman called into the Crime Stoppers line. She only identified herself as a friend of Patricia's. Church asked her for her name, and if they could meet. That just made her more upset. The woman began to cry. She said that she believed Ted was behind his wife's death. Ted's not the man people think he is, she said. It's all just a charade. Patricia was scared, and then she tapered off, and Church said Patricia knew what? What was she scared of? So the woman told Church that Patricia was afraid of Ted and of what he could do to her. They were having problems, and it was like Ted didn't want to be married anymore. Patricia believed that he was planning something. Patricia told me. The woman said we were best friends, and she continued on, saying that she and Patricia had been very close, and Patricia had told her that she didn't think Ted wanted to spend any time alone with her. They did things together, but they were never alone. And they were having money problems, too. Patricia was always careful with her money, but she said that Ted was spending it as fast as he could make it. Patricia also believed that Ted had taken a second job, just as another excuse to be away from her.
So that's pretty sad that she was feeling that way. I mean, even if she wasn't murdered, it's sad that she felt that way in her marriage.
Yeah.
But the thing was, they really didn't need the money. The woman said, their bills were being paid with their regular jobs, but Patricia said that Ted just kept wanting more. In fact, he wanted a motorcycle, but Patricia said, we really can't afford it. And he got really mad at her over that. And then last week, the woman told Church, Patricia told me about the life insurance, and she was so scared. The woman was crying as she explained that a few weeks ago, Patricia and Ted had had an argument over life insurance. They had some already. They were both already covered through their jobs, but Ted wanted to take out another policy. Now, these are young, healthy people with no children. And Patricia told Ted, we don't need another policy. But then she found out that he had taken it out anyway. He took the policy out without Patricia knowing. And she had only found out about it when the doctor's office called to set up an appointment for her blood work. So Ted had forged her name on the policy.
Is that legal?
No, of course not. So Detective Church was able to reach the insurance agent by phone to see about getting a copy of that policy. Jerry Webster, an arson specialist, was meeting investigators at the scene to reconstruct the fire and also to see about getting an approximate time of death. Kind of difficult the way things were, right?
Oh, yeah.
As the other investigators met with the arson specialist, Detective Church took out the file from the second break-in that had happened at the Kimble house recently. Since Church hadn't worked the burglary case, he wasn't familiar with it. It had happened just over a year ago, and a short time after, a man named Howard Sawyer had been arrested. So as Church looked through the list of stolen items, one thing did catch his attention, and that was an Olympus 35mm camera. The camera sitting on the Kimble's desk in the second bedroom had been an Olympus 35mm camera. So unless the Kimbles had gone out and bought the exact same type and brand of camera after that burglary, this was the same one, so it had never actually been stolen. But why would Patricia have falsified a report? It really didn't fit her character. But it had been Ted, not Patricia, who had signed the report. So Church typed the case number into the computer to see if it had gone to trial yet. And yes, a man named Howard Sawyer had recently been convicted, and he was being held in the county jail. So Detective Church took the list of stolen items and he went straight to the jail to talk to that guy. You know, there might be a pattern of insurance fraud with Ted.
Oh, that would be very suspicious.
Absolutely.
When Howard Sawyer came into the interview room where Church was waiting for him, he sat down across from the detective. Church asked Sawyer to take a look at the list of items reported stolen from the Kimble home, giving him the address of the house that he had been convicted of burglarizing. So he wanted Sawyer to look at the list and see if the items matched the items he was charged with stealing. So Sawyer looked at the list and he said, I didn't take half of that stuff that's listed there. He hadn't taken the camera or a necklace that was reported as a $600 claim. He said that he had seen a cheap costume jewelry necklace, but he hadn't bothered to take it because it wasn't worth anything.
Yeah, so there's another flag for Ted.
You bet.
So next, Detective Church met with the insurance agent. He had brought the paperwork with him, including the application and a copy of the policy, as it would have been written on Patricia Kimble. He said right away that he had an uneasy feeling about Ted. He knew something wasn't right with this application, he said, because Mrs. Kimble had been so upset about it. But he could tell that she didn't want to cause a scene. So Church stared at Patricia's signature on this application. It definitely wasn't the same signature he'd seen on her canceled checks that he'd taken from the home. $100,000, he said. But there's a rider that said in case of an accidental death, the policy paid $200,000, which is significant because he was looking at about $180,000 to buy that land. Plus he wanted a motorcycle.
Yeah, well,
it's all kind of adding up to a real shitstorm.
Seems to be.
The insurance agent had met with Ted a few weeks earlier, and Ted had called and said that he and his wife were interested in a life insurance policy. So he'd met with Ted a few times, but Patricia was not at any of these meetings. When he asked Ted, Ted said that he handled all the business affairs, and there was no need to involve his wife. But the agent told Ted she'd have to sign the application, and Ted looked unhappy about that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So the agent offered to meet with Ted and Patricia at their house, thinking, well, maybe it was inconvenient and he'd be helpful. But no, Ted had insisted on meeting with the agent at his workplace. So the agent had met with Ted at Lyle's Building Supplies, and on the day Patricia had become upset, she wasn't expected to be there. What she'd done is she dropped in to bring Ted his lunch, and when she learned that Ted was in a meeting with the agent and what it was about, she began to cry, and she ran out of the office. The agent then asked Ted if he should come back another time, but Ted said, nah, I'll handle it. So the agent went forward with the application, but, in order for it to be approved, the company would require Patricia to have a medical exam. The agent called her at home to arrange an appointment, and she became hysterical during that call. She even hung up on him. When asked if he had notified Ted that the application could not be processed, the agent said no, he hadn't been able to reach him, so Ted was not aware that that insurance policy was not in effect.
Right. But then the agent said that Ted had called him that same morning.
Yeah, the same morning after Patricia's death.
Right. And Ted said that he was trying to arrange the funeral for Patricia and wanted to know when he could collect on her insurance policy. Huh.
She's
Poor
dead
Ted.
2 days.
Big surprise to the detectives.
Well, I would think so. That's just unheard of, I would think. Why would you even be thinking of that?
No, you're trying to get her buried and move on.
Okay, well, there's supposed to be a grieving period, which I guess we just totally skipped.
We just forget that.
Yeah.
So at the funeral home prior to Patricia's funeral, Ted, Reuben, and Patricia's parents met with the funeral director. Now, the first thing that came out of Ted's mouth was that he didn't care how much the funeral cost. Money wasn't important. What was important was that she had the best. Then her father told the director that he wanted her to have a nice casket. Ted said, no, we don't need a casket because she's going to be cremated. Ted said that was what Patricia had wanted, but no one else believed that. And then Ted said something that caused her family members to feel almost physically sick. He said, well, I mean, really, what's the point in a casket? She was practically already cremated in the fire.
Jesus.
He's a very empathetic person.
How can you be that insensitive? Her poor mother burst into tears right there, and Reuben and his father were just horrified. This was his wife.
Yeah.
So the State Bureau of Investigation and the Fire Marshal's Office determined through a computer recreation that the fire had burned for at least 2 hours and for as long as 4 hours. The medical examiner's report showed that her body had contained less than 5% carbon monoxide saturation, so Patricia was dead long before her body was burned. Her body had been found face down, arms pointing toward the master bedroom. The bullet had entered her brain just behind her left ear and traveled through the left temporal lobe, the brainstem, and the right temporal lobe, so death probably did occur instantly. It was quick, and she likely felt no pain, except for maybe the emotional pain she would have suffered if she realized who was her killer. But Patricia probably didn't see her killer. They thought that he had laid in wait for her, and she never had a chance to react or try and defend herself or anything. They thought she was killed immediately after entering the house. She had entered through the back door, walked through the kitchen and into the hallway, heading for the master bedroom. Patricia's car was parked on the left side of the driveway, leading investigators to speculate that another car had been on the right side of the driveway. So if Patricia had seen the car, she must have recognized it, or she wouldn't have gone into the house at all. So who had been parked there?
Oh, let me guess. Maybe,
it's a mystery.
Maybe Ted.
Well, no, Ted has an alibi.
Oh,
Ted was at work.
He does have. We haven't gotten to his alibi, but we will.
We will.
Now, Patricia had left her office at 3:30 p.m. on the day she was killed. Would have taken her about 15 minutes to get home. If she got home by 4, she still would have had time to mow the lawn, take a shower, and change her clothes for her 7 o'clock prayer meeting. But she never made it to the prayer meeting. By 7 p.m., it's likely that Patricia had already been dead for 3 hours. The owner of the apartment complex where Patricia had been working called detectives just days after her murder to tell them that Ted had called to try and collect on her life insurance policy. He'd called about the 2 different policies on the same day. Like many others, the owner of the apartments thought that it was odd that Ted would be calling to collect on the policy just a couple days after his wife's death.
Well, of course. That's just crazy.
Ted's alibi checked out. The time of death was determined to be between 4 p.m. and 6 p.m. According to one of the guys that worked at Lyle's, Kimble was there all afternoon. But then Ted punched into his shift at Precision Fabrics at 6:10. So he does have the alibi. Couldn't have done what he did.
What he did? He couldn't have killed her, you mean? Got it.
So now the police had to consider maybe Ted had an accomplice because they were pretty committed to the idea that he did it or was behind it.
Well, he's not hiding it very well.
No, he sure isn't.
So detectives still found it odd that Ted had taken a job at Precision Fabrics for just over $6 an hour when he actually owned his own business. He had only been at Precision for about a month, so they had to wonder if he'd taken the job just to give himself an alibi for his wife's murder. He could have had an accomplice, and he could have taken the job to help with an alibi. But it was all a theory until they found some proof. Gary Lyles, Ted's former boss, came into the police station to speak to Detective Church. Church had met Lyles earlier in the week when he stopped by the store to talk to Ted. So Lyles had traveled from his retirement home in Long Beach, North Carolina, to help out in the store after Patricia's death, so Ted would have time to make his funeral arrangements. Lyles was a fit-looking guy in his early 60s, kind of an early-ish retirement. His gray hair was thinning on top, but he still had his thick gray mustache. Church felt really comfortable in his presence, seeing him as a very honest and straightforward person. Gary Lyles had known Patricia before she even began dating Ted, when they were just friends. And he had known Ted since he was a boy, like 10 years old, because he and his wife had been members at Ted's father's church, and he had actually helped to build that church. So Ronnie Jr. had called Lyles at about 5 o'clock on the morning of the fire, and he had asked Lyles if he could come up and take care of the business for the week. Ted actually owned the business now. Lyles had sold it to him in late 1993. It was right before he and Patricia got married. Lyle told Detective Church that Ted had been working for him since he was 15 years old, and he described him as a good worker and a really smart boy. He had wanted Ted to have his business after taking him under his wing. He really loved him like a son. Ted used to come to Gary for advice, and if he needed to borrow some money. He felt comfortable selling his business to Ted, but only after he had become engaged to Patricia. Gary thought a lot of Patricia. He knew she was a smart girl and very level-headed. So Lyles believed that marrying her would make Ted more responsible. He said he hadn't actually pushed for the engagement, but he was definitely happy and approved of it.
So the police set up video cameras for Patricia's funeral. You never know who might appear, right?
Yeah, or how they might act, or who knows.
Ted's brother Ronnie was there in his Marine uniform, and he was very emotional. Ted, on the other hand, was laughing and chatting with the guests, acting more like someone would behave at a wedding than at a funeral. His mother Edna stood beside him and greeted people. Looking at Patricia's urn, which held her ashes, Ted said, "Yep, she's in there." Edna smiled and commented that Patricia weighs a lot less now than she did when she was alive. Oh, God. Then the mother and son got a little giggly together.
Isn't that awful? And that was kind of a fat joke because she was a little chubby. Isn't that gross? Right. And Edna was the one who was outside the window crying for her.
Yeah. Well,
so I don't know what the fuck happened with her brain.
She's definitely made a quick recovery from her grief.
Absolutely she has, yeah. Jeez, awful.
The detectives interviewed an old girlfriend of Ronnie's from high school. She and her twin sister had dated Ronnie and Ted. Ronnie got her pregnant, she told them, and it was Ted who forced her into having an abortion. On the day of the abortion, Ted had driven up to her house with Ronnie in the passenger seat. And when she got into the car, she tried to talk to Ronnie. Ted told her just shut up. He drove her to the clinic, took her inside, where she went through with the procedure. So this woman at least felt that Ted was a pretty mean person, and he certainly controlled Ronnie. And this would make detectives wonder if Ronnie could be Ted's accomplice in Patricia's murder.
Well, it did seem that Ted was the leader in this relationship. Also, there's the thought that maybe Ted would hold that pregnancy and abortion over Ronnie's head, because that's a very religious family. The parents would not be cool with that. Not at all.
That's for sure.
So next, they interviewed Ronnie's wife, Kimberly. And Kimberly told detectives that Ronnie had been on leave when Patricia was killed, so he had been in town. He had left their house about 3 p.m. to return a truck to Lyles, and then he was gone until at least 5. Not only was Ronnie Kimble in Greensboro the day that Patricia died, but he was with Ted just hours before Patricia died. So if Kimberly was telling the truth, there was a 2-hour time period when Ronnie was unaccounted for. And these were the same hours during which Patricia was likely killed. Another friend of Patricia's came to the police station to talk to detectives. "Something needs to be done about Ted," she said. "It's just not right what he's doing." So according to this woman, Ted was acting like he didn't care that his wife had just been murdered. For example, their Sunday school class went out to eat for one of their members' birthdays, and Ted was there showing off his elaborate plans for a dream house he planned to build. He already had the blueprints drawn up. Also, Ted had purchased an expensive motorcycle with the money people had donated to him after Patricia died. This is the motorcycle he'd wanted that Patricia had told them they couldn't afford.
Yeah, well, now he could get it.
Exactly. But what really bothered this friend the most was that Ted was already dating. It had only been 10 days since Patricia's death, but Ted had this young girlfriend. So this all sounded like Ted didn't care about Patricia at all. But it's not evidence of a crime, so of course they need more. Ted had become involved in a romantic relationship with a woman named Janice Johnson about 2 to 3 weeks after Patricia died. Annie brought her to the house and showed her where Patricia's body was found, and she would say he was very unemotional about it. Ted was very angry that he wasn't getting insurance money in the amounts he had wanted, this Janice later told investigators. And Ted had claimed exaggerated values for the contents of the house on the insurance claims, and she'd also witnessed an argument between Ted and Ronnie. She also said that Ted always carried a gun on him during the time she dated him. He was never without a gun, so kind of obsessed with guns.
Yeah, then detectives spoke with Ann Mauney, who is an experienced officer with the North Carolina Department of Insurance. She came into Church's office with a 5-inch thick file on Ted Kimble. Ted was already trying to collect on insurance policies. Patricia's work policy would pay him, but the larger policy was never valid. All he had was an application that was obviously forged. So Church asked about Ted's homeowner's policy. Ted claimed $270,000 on $2,000 worth of fire damage and an additional $50,000 for structural damage. Ted had also filed for breaking and entering claims and a claim for his car. So Mauney saw a clear pattern of escalation. Ted had started with car insurance, then burglaries, and had worked his way up to murder. And Ted was now asking for $16,000 to cover his living expenses while he was displaced from his home. He claimed that he deserved living accommodations equal to what he had become accustomed to, 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, just for him. He claimed that he was going to rent his parents' house while they moved into a single-wide mobile home at the back of their property.
Now, why would you even do that?
I know.
Now, they didn't ever do it, but
yeah,
why would you put 2 people in a mobile home and 1 person in a 3-bedroom house?
Well, it's Ted.
Now, they definitely had enough to arrest him for insurance fraud, but they didn't want to act. They wanted him to be free to, dig his own grave, basically.
Yeah, they want the big one.
Now, Ted said he was too busy to come into the police station for an interview, so detectives went to talk to him at Lyle's. He was smug with the detectives and showed no concern for finding his wife's killer. He told Church that finding Patricia's killer was his job. Ted himself was busy with his own business. When asked why he hadn't told the police that his brother Ronnie had been to his house on October 9th, the day that Patricia died, Ted said that he didn't bother to tell them because he was sure that Ronnie was not involved in her death. Then they showed Ted the life insurance application that he'd forged. And he admitted to forging her name, claiming that she'd been having a tough time at work and he didn't want to bother her with it. But Ted insisted that he had canceled that policy. So even though it had never been approved and never went into effect, he said he'd canceled it.
Yeah.
When Church asked why then did he try and collect on the policy 2 days after his wife's death, if it was canceled or never went into effect, Ted laughed and he said, hey, it looks like I'm being treated like a suspect here. What's going on? Then he wasn't going to talk anymore. He was getting a lawyer.
Probably a good idea for Ted.
That's the last he spoke to them.
So next the police talked to a guy named Oliver. He worked at Lyle's with Ted. He reported that he had seen Ronnie at Lyle's a little after 3 p.m., and he was sure of the time because he was returning from his lunch break when Ronnie was leaving. And all he knew was that Ronnie had been there talking to Ted. Now, the police needed to confirm what time Ronnie had arrived home. Detectives drove out to his in-laws' house, which was right next door to his house. Ronnie's mother and father-in-law, James and Judy Stump, were polite and helpful, and they invited him in. James told the detectives that he had got home from work around 5 p.m. and Ronnie was there, but he hadn't gotten much work done. So the 2 men were supposed to be putting some skirting up along the bottom of their mobile home, and they didn't know when Ronnie had arrived home. But James just assumed that Ronnie was waiting for him to help, but it could have been that Ronnie had just got there right before James had.
Yeah, so we really don't know where he was between like 3:15 and 5-ish.
Yeah.
And we think Patricia was probably shot in the head around 4.
Somewhere around there. Yeah.
They don't know specifically, but they have a pretty good idea.
Yeah, they do.
The detectives went out to Gary Lyle's house for a second interview. And it's a good thing they did, because they learned some things. His wife Rose told them a very interesting story. On the Friday before she died, Patricia called the Lyles' house, and she wanted to talk to Gary. Remember, she was very friendly with Gary. But he wasn't there. She was so upset, though, she said she had to talk to someone. So even though she didn't know Rose really well, she confided in Rose. She was so afraid, Rose said. She had just found out about an insurance policy Ted had taken out on her life, and she was terrified. She was so scared that Rose felt sorry for her. She couldn't understand why Ted would do such a thing, especially since Patricia had told him they didn't need any more insurance. So Patricia said, Rose, I'm telling you this in case anything ever happens to me. It's Ted. So, big news.
Very big.
How many times have we read about that? About a murder victim a few days before their death saying, if anything ever happens to me.
And they're right.
Yeah, in the cases we've done, they are.
Yeah. It's not just an imaginary thought or something like that. There's facts to back it up.
Absolutely.
So as Rose told the story, Gary shook his head and held his face in his hands. They hadn't thought too much of it when they got the call. Gary thought that she was just overreacting. Rose was grief-stricken and guilt-stricken. She began to sob. Gary was beginning to doubt Ted for the very first time. He had to wonder if Ted had something to do with Patricia's murder. Gary couldn't believe that Ted would be capable of that, but now he's got to wonder.
Well, Ted was basically like a son to him. He was his mentor.
Yeah.
So it was really a lot for him to accept that this kid who he'd known since he was 10, and he thought of as his son, and he'd taken over the business and everything, was capable of murdering Patricia, who Gary also loved. Patricia's brother Reuben remembered an incident from just a month before Patricia's murder, which had made him very concerned for his sister's safety. He said that Ted was showing off a new laser sight that he'd bought for his handgun, and Ted had said, "Isn't this the coolest? Check it out." And he'd aimed it at the living room window from where he was standing in the front yard. And Reuben had seen the red ray of light beamed from the gun through the glass, past the living room, and into the kitchen, where he saw a small red circle glowing in the center of Patricia's forehead.
How nice.
That is really something.
And then in 1996, Ted threatened to kill 2 of his employees. They were stealing lumber with Ted. I mean, this is part of a ring.
Yeah, they'd been doing it for a while, probably before Patricia died.
And when they wanted to stop, Ted said if they did that, he would kill them both. Then he added something about how he knew he could get away with murder because he already had been for a year.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Still, the police really only had a circumstantial case against Ted. But then in January of 1997, Ronnie made a confession to an old friend from the Marines, Lewis Whidden. After leaving the Marines, Whidden stated he enrolled at Liberty University to begin his studies for a career in the ministry. Then he heard from Ronnie Kimble about him possibly enrolling at Liberty University as well. Ronnie wanted to visit the campus, so Whidden offered to let him stay at his house. On January 24, 1997, according to Whidden, Ronnie and his wife Kimberly showed up at his house. During this visit, Whidden stated he was approached by Ronnie to talk in private. Whidden stated that Ronnie suggested they go upstairs to talk, and once upstairs, Whidden stated that Ronnie confessed to the murder of his sister-in-law. Whidden stated he was told by Ronnie that Whidden was the only person he had told about the murder, and then Ronnie began to cry. Whidden stated that Ronnie told him that he had shot Patricia and that he didn't know where the gun was. Whidden stated he was told by Ronnie that he had committed the murder purely for greed. And Whidden stated that Ronnie went on to say that he had been approached by Ted, who had offered Ronnie money to commit the murder of Patricia. So he'd actually lost the gun or left it behind, and although they couldn't tell exactly, it had come from a bullet that could have come from the Glock that Ted owned.
Okay.
So it was the same kind of bullet, and Ronnie didn't know where the gun was.
So during the same conversation, Whidden stated Ronnie explained that he was struggling with himself over use of the money. At this point, Whidden stated Ronnie then offered Whidden the money that he was about to receive from his brother.
Yeah, I guess he saw it as blood money and didn't want to spend it, so Ronnie did have a bit of a conscience.
Yeah, but Whidden refused to take the money. He did encourage Ronnie to turn himself into the police, but Ronnie said that he couldn't turn himself into the authorities because he was afraid of getting the chair. So after confessing to the murder, Whidden stated that Ronnie had asked Whidden, "Do you think any less of me now?" Ronnie told Whidden that he believed it was Patricia's time to go, whether he had done it or not. Well, he's just repeating what his dumbass brother told him.
Probably, yeah. So Whidden went to Jerry Falwell and told him that Ronnie had confessed to this murder and asked him for his advice. Falwell suggested that Whidden speak with Liberty University attorneys, and as suggested, Whidden met with the attorneys to determine his legal responsibility over what had been told to him by Ronnie. Whidden stated that he was told by the attorneys that they would investigate the matter and contact him later. But when Whidden went to see Ronnie at Camp Lejeune, Ronnie said that he had not confessed to Whidden earlier, but he'd just been telling him about a dream he had.
Okay.
So it hadn't been real. Then in February, Whidden was interviewed by the State Bureau of Investigations and by the local detectives. He believed that Ronnie's confession was real, and now he was worried that Ronnie might take his own life because he did feel a lot of guilt. But now he wouldn't admit to this.
Yeah. So arrest warrants were issued for both Ronnie and Ted Kimble, February 28, 1997. More interviews were done with the co-workers of Ted and fellow Marines from Camp Lejeune. The two employees from Lyles who were involved in the theft ring with Ted Kimble were given plea deals for their cooperation and testimony about what Ted had told them regarding his wife's murder. Now, they could have gotten sentences of up to 14 years, but instead they got probation. Nice deal.
Well, from what I understand, these guys had no criminal history until they'd gotten involved in this ring. And it seems like when it started out, Ted was telling them that they were going to pick up lumber or equipment, forklifts, things like that other places didn't want anymore. So he kind of conned them into stealing, and then they got involved in it, and then of course they did know what they were doing. But they weren't like lifelong criminals, so they did have some credibility as witnesses.
Okay. And they did help the case for the prosecution.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So while he was waiting his trial, sitting in jail, Ted developed a hit list. He tried to hire an inmate who was getting out soon to kill the people on his hit list. His list included the co-workers from his theft ring, Gary and his wife Rose Lyles, and Patricia's best friend.
So now you really get a good idea about this guy's character or lack of it, right?
Well, that's for sure.
It's one thing to kill your wife. It's horrible. But then to sit in jail and think about who else you could kill means he has no conscience about it whatsoever. He wants to keep on killing.
Yeah.
So something's seriously missing with him.
No kidding. Beside each name on the list was the manner in which they were to be killed. This is Ted's wishes. So
Yeah.
Electrocution, a robbery gone bad, a rape, strangulation. And then Ted also had plans to escape from jail. So now he's looking at 8 new charges for solicitation to commit murder. Not only did the fellow inmate notify the police of Ted's plan, but then an SBI officer found the hit list inside of Ted's cell.
Yeah, so it's not just hearsay from another, jailbird.
Nope.
They've got the list. Ronnie pleaded not guilty, and he went to trial in August of 1998. In their opening statement, the prosecutor laid out what they believed happened to Patricia and how they would prove Ronnie's guilt. The prosecutor told the jury that evidence would show that Patricia went to her house, parked on the left side because there was already a car she recognized on the right, got out of her car, entered through the kitchen door, and then entered through the garage. She left her keys in the ignition, car on lock, and her purse open on her front seat. She entered the kitchen door, went through the living room and into the hallway, which led to the 3 bedrooms. She was on her way to the back bedroom where her dog was penned up in the bathroom, and she would normally, as soon as she got home, let the dog out, to go outside. But as she passed the first doorway on the left, which was a bathroom, a .45 caliber bullet struck her in the head, went through her brain, and lodged near her ear. So she fell to the floor, probably died very quickly. But then gasoline was poured on her body and in a path through the living room and the kitchen. The back bedrooms were ransacked to make it look like a burglary. But the front rooms, the rooms that Patricia would pass through as she went to the kitchen and living room, and into the hallway, were undisturbed. So you have to wonder if they were left that way, so on her way she wouldn't notice anything, right?
Right.
As a result, she didn't know that anyone was waiting for her or that anything odd was even going on. And her poor little dog was left to die in the fire.
Ted was working his second job at Precision Fabrics. At 8 o'clock, he called Patricia's brother Reuben with the story that he couldn't get a hold of her and he couldn't leave. Could you go check on her? Reuben then went to find Patricia, and eventually around 8:30, 8:45, he went to her house where he saw her car in the driveway. And he went to the door, felt the heat, saw the smoke, and he called 911 as his wife went to get Patricia's dad from down the street. Now, in their opening statement, the defense gave Ronnie an alibi, claiming that he hadn't gone to Laos until 4 p.m., and then he had gone home to help his father-in-law with the trailer skirting. They also pointed out that Ronnie was a well-respected Marine, and that the house had been ransacked because someone was there looking for something. There's just no evidence, according to the defense, that Ronnie had anything to do with Patricia's murder.
Well, Ted invoked his Fifth Amendment right not to testify. But family members, former friends, insurance agents, and co-workers all testified. The state of North Carolina called 57 witnesses to establish their case against Ronnie Kimble. And in the end, the jury only deliberated for a few hours, I think it was 5 hours, before they found Ronnie guilty of first-degree felony murder. And he was sentenced to life in prison. He was also given another 15 to 20 years for arson and for conspiracy to commit murder.
Ted Kimble took a plea deal. He confessed to second-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, first-degree arson, and 8 counts of solicitation to commit first-degree murder. He received consecutive sentences for each of these charges. Ted also agreed to return the ashes of Patricia Blakely Kimble to the Blakely family, and the state agreed to dismiss any breaking and entry or larceny indictments. So Ted was sentenced in the end to 107 years in prison.
Yeah, and he never did give her family her ashes. And he had made a couple different stories about what he had done with them. But Ted Kimble sent a letter to Judge Peter McHugh in 1999 trying to withdraw his plea agreement and requesting a change of venue. Now both were denied. Both Ted and Ronnie have exhausted all of their appeals. Ted claims that he's innocent despite his plea. Ronnie stands by his story that he was only talking about a dream that he had with Whidden and it was not a confession. He suggested on the documentary American Justice that Ted may have planned the murders with another accomplice. So he wasn't really standing up for his brother Ted anymore.
Right.
But he's not admitting to being involved.
Yeah, okay. So Ted and Ronnie's mother and father, Ron and Edna, stand by their son's claims of innocence. They believe that the police had it out for Ted and didn't investigate other possible suspects. There's a Kimble Brothers blog where the arguments for their innocence are laid out. They also ask for assistance from law students, law professors, paralegals, and attorneys. They believe that an interrupted burglary is the most reasonable explanation for what happened to Patricia Kimble.
Well, I really don't fault those people. Well, I do fault Edna for the shit she said at the funeral. But I don't fault them for standing by their children. They have 2 children and they're both in prison for life.
Right.
So that's a really hard life to live for the parents. Now, killing Patricia was just an absolutely horrible, cruel crime because she did sincerely love Ted. And by all accounts, she tried to do her best to be a good person and a good wife. Lying in wait and shooting her in the head was awful, but then the fire and burning of her body, that's just like another punch in the gut for those who loved her. There were crime scene photos available on the PwC Consulting website, and I'm going to recommend not looking at them. Very upsetting.
You didn't like what you saw.
Oh my God, Dick. And I've seen some bad shit doing this show, right?
Right.
But just horrible. Oh my gosh. Doesn't even really look like a person. So I can't even imagine what finding her body in that shape was like for the firefighters and the law enforcement people working the case. I don't know. I think that Ronnie has some mental health issues, and I think that Ted, just a psychopath or, Yeah, more than a sociopath. I think he's a psychopath.
Yeah.
And it really seems that Patricia was used by Ted from the beginning. That's what really hurts. Because he knew. He knew she cared about him.
Yeah.
And he was basically using her to get what he wanted, right?
Sure.
So what a dick. Not a good dick, a bad dick.
Yeah, he's a piece of work.
Ugh. Well, I know we've heard quite a few stories about husbands killing their wives, but I'll never get over it. Never get past it. And this one is just extraordinarily bad.
Sure is.
So TCB's music was written and produced by Tristan Capel. If you have a case suggestion you'd like to share with us, please send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com. Or even better, if you want your voice to be heard, there is the option of leaving a voicemail. How do you do it? Super easy. Go to our website, tiegrabber.com, and just click on Send a Voicemail. Also, I will put a link in our show notes that you can use to record a voicemail for us. We've gotten quite a few lately, and we really like them. If you'd like to get all of your future TCB episodes without commercials and get the extra members-only episode each month, plus have a gift sent to you, what you can do is go to our website, tiegrabber.com, and click on subscribe, and then you'll see your options for doing that. It's as cheap as $4 a month, and it really helps to support our paying for the storage of the files and all that, because there is some expense to that.
And the research, there's a lot of stuff that gets done to put an episode out.
Yeah, more than we ever thought, right?
Yes.
There's also a long list of episodes in that premium feed that will be available to you when you sign up. So if you like our shows, you could binge quite a few of them. And some of them are really fun. You even get the old holiday specials, and those are really fun to listen to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're interested in that, click on subscribe and take a look. We also have merch for sale at tiegrabber.com/shop. If you want to treat yourself or buy somebody a hoodie or a t-shirt or a snifter to drink your beer, that's a great thing. Check that out. So enough of my sales talk, Dickie. Why don't you let us know about feedback now?
We got some feedback, of course. And it's the usual collection of a couple voicemails and one email.
Oh, you like that configuration, don't you?
Yeah, I'm going to run with that. So we have a case suggestion from Amy. And that's the first voicemail.
Hi, Jill and Dick. This is Amy Bachna from Cleveland, Ohio. And I was wondering if you guys ever covered the torso murders from the Cleveland area back in, I believe they were in the 30s. I'm not sure if you guys go back that far. And I just recently became a member. So I love listening to you guys. And I like the beer side of it. That's really cool. And I'm not sure if you know that Cleveland has a ton of craft brews, and we're really popular. Burning River is great. Great Lakes Brewery as well. Great Lakes Brewery, you know, probably that was Elliot Ness would go there. So feel free to look into that. I hope to see a story about that. I'll look back in your archives. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
I wanted to play this one just because it was almost a 100-year-old case.
Yes, fascinating.
That was interesting, so I thought that would be something to do. They've never been able to identify the killer. That's another interesting thing.
So probably a serial killer.
Yeah, they called him the torso murderer. Also, he was known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run.
Wow.
So he's unidentified to this day. At least 12 people were killed and dismembered, and their remains were left in Kingsbury Run, which is a poor part of town.
Why the torso murder? Because they just found torsos?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but I think that's a good one to look into. Actually, I had been looking online earlier this morning and I bought 4 or 5 books about missing persons and murders from the late 1800s, early 1900s. Because it's fascinating. Just the way that you investigate something like that back then is so different.
Yeah.
And just the way people behave in general was very different. Life was different, right?
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting thing to do for a change anyway. So absolutely. Thank you, Amy. That's a great case suggestion.
The other kind of neat thing is that Elliot Ness worked the case for a time.
Yeah, I don't know much about Elliot Ness except Al Capone type stuff, right?
Yeah, that's what we know him from.
Yeah. Didn't Kevin Costner play him in a movie?
Yeah.
What's that movie?
The Untouchables.
Oh, right. Yep. Yeah, just in case you don't know, Dick has a little bit of a man crush on Kevin Costner. So anything he's in, we have to watch, even though I'd say he's not the best actor.
No, but who could ever forget the best baseball movie ever?
Right. What's that called? Field of Dreams?
Field of Dreams is a good one.
Oh, you mean the romance one. What's that?
Bull Durham.
Bull Durham.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dickie loves that.
Okay.
You're such a romantic. Okay, so let's do another voicemail.
Another voicemail from Becky. And this is a more recent case. I think this is only a few years old.
Hi, Jill and Dick. My name is Becky, and I am calling you from the Midwest of Illinois. I have a case review. This is set in South Carolina, and it is about Timothy Jones, who had killed his 5 children. He bludgeoned one to death and then strangled the other 4 and then drove around with their bodies in his car for 7 days. After he disposed of the bodies, he was stopped at a sobriety checkpoint, and that's when they found this pungent smell of death and searched his car and found cleaning supplies, children clothing, and so on and so forth. Anyhow, this has a lot of twists and turns, and I know that you have a tough time when it comes to children. However, your reach out to everybody when they see something, say something, made me think of you when it comes to this. Anyhow, he drove around with them and he put their bodies into bags and then he dumped them all along the roadsides over 3 different states. I don't think he dumped them in 3 different states, but he drove around with them for 7 days in 3 different states.
Motherfucker.
Anyhow, it's Timothy Jones, and he has been reported to be schizophrenic. He's going for the insanity defense, and this is another way of saying that the DCFS field failed again. Anyhow, on a lighter and good note, I want to tell you guys that I love your banter between each other. The affection and stuff that you have for each other is fantastic. I have just been recently subscribed, got my swag today, love it, it's fantastic, and guess what I'm drinking out of?
Your snifter.
Yes.
Love it. Love the new snifter that I've got and all the other swag I've received. So I hope that maybe you will take into consideration to do this podcast for this and these poor children. They are so cute. Anyhow, I'm not really good at this, so it's probably going to sound a little quirky, but you guys have a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, or whenever you get to read this or hear this. Thanks and have a great day. Bye.
Thanks, Becky. No, that was a wonderful voicemail. You were great.
Yeah.
Yeah, very well spoken. And heartbreaking case, sure, but definitely interesting.
Well, I would just say, he's obviously insane.
Yes, but is there an overlap with insane and evil sometimes where you can be both?
Oh, I suppose.
I would guess. So I don't know what happened did he have a wife? Because I hope she wasn't alive to have to deal with this. That poor woman.
They were separated or something.
So maybe he did it to get back at her?
I don't know.
I'm just speculating.
I think we have to do some more research.
Oh, absolutely, of course.
Quickly looked him up on Google, the Google machine.
So how recent was this? How old is this case?
I think it's just 2 or 3 years.
Oh, my God. All right. Wow. Okay. Well, we will look into that, Becky. Thank you very much. Some of these are heartbreaking and hard to deal with, but at the same time, everybody's story should get out, and hopefully we can learn something from it. It's not just entertainment. We're learning things.
Correct.
Yes. Okay. Let's do our one email.
We've got an email from our old standby, Nate. Very, very good about suggesting cases. And
he's one of the top contributors, right? Nate and Cindy are the top 2.
Probably.
So Nate wrote, I have another case for you to consider for 2022. No one has covered it yet in the podcast world. Sandra Oriana in California fell to her death off a balcony at a hotel in California in 1996. Was it accidental or was it murder? Her boss went on trial in 2002 but was acquitted. So, actually, we were so fascinated with this recommendation that we found, was it a 48 Hours episode?
Yeah, I believe it was 48 hours.
I think it was. It was an older one about this case because I thought that's fascinating. Plus, I have this horrible fear of heights, so these kind of cases always kind of, poke me. So what do we know about it?
So, yes, they were attending a business conference, staying at a hotel. They were in adjoining rooms on the 8th floor.
She fell over 100 feet. We know that.
Yeah, they were in room 813 and 815. And it's a horrible story, no matter how you look at it. Initially, Salazar said that she didn't show up in the morning.
Well, that's what made him look guilty to me.
Yeah.
Yes, because he pretended she was still alive. He didn't call for help, although he did see her fall.
Yeah, because he had to change his story. And, he changed his story because they found some of his clothing in her room.
Yeah.
So he said yes, and she fell. And I just, for whatever reason, didn't call 911 at the time.
I'm sorry, but he said he was trying to hide it from his wife. He didn't want his wife to find out. But if someone falls and dies in front of you, you don't worry about that. Come on.
Yep, I know.
And according to her family, she was engaged to someone else. She's a pretty young girl. I guess there was some drinking and holding hands and stuff down in the hotel bar. But still.
Well, and then the other thing he said was that they had consensual sex, and then she went over the railing. There's just a lot of...
There's a lot of things about it.
That bothers you about that story.
Absolutely, yeah. But there's a lot to talk about because there's a lot of things that he said that I don't believe. There's some things that other people said. So
yeah,
it's still kind of a mystery.
It's a big mystery. And I'm not going to tell you how it ends up.
No, but she was a young girl. What was she, like 30 years old?
27.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, so it's really sad.
Very.
Okay.
So we're definitely doing that case.
We are?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you to everyone for listening to us and for sending in your comments, your suggestions. Very much appreciated.
Very much.
So we'll probably won't speak to everyone again until after Christmas.
Right. So happy holidays. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to those who celebrate that. And we'll see you next time at the quiet end.
We'll save a seat for you.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye, guys.